My father stood at the head of the Thanksgiving table, tapped his wine glass with a butter knife, and waited for the room to go quiet. I remember thinking he was about to make a toast. That was the kind of man he was. He loved an audience. When everyone turned toward him, he set down his glass and looked directly at me. "Portia, I think you should leave now, and I don't think you should come back." No explanation, no warning, just that sentence, delivered like a business decision, in front of my mother, my cousin, my aunt and uncle, and two family friends who had been coming to our Thanksgiving dinner in North Vancouver every October for as long as I could remember. I sat there with a plate of untouched turkey in front of me and counted 4 full seconds of silence before people started reaching for their cutlery again. That was the worst part, not the words, the speed at which everyone else decided to move on. 4 days later, every bank account tied to my family's property management company was frozen. My father was on the phone with RBC before 9 in the morning, certain there had been a system error or a government audit gone sideways. He never once considered that the daughter he had pushed out the door might have had anything to do with it. Stay with me, because that evening at the Thanksgiving table was only the beginning. My name is Portia Gallagher. I am 32 years old. I grew up in North Vancouver, in a house my grandmother bought in the early 80s when prices were still something ordinary families could imagine. My family runs Gallagher Property Group, a mid-size residential and commercial property management company that my grandfather started, and my father grew through the 90s and early 2000s. For 7 years, I worked inside that company doing financial compliance and tenant operations. My job was to keep the books clean, catch problems before they became expensive, and make sure everything we did held up under scrutiny. What I found over the 18 months before that Thanksgiving was a slow and deliberate leak in the company's finances. Not dramatic at first, a maintenance invoice that looked slightly high, a contractor I had never seen before whose invoices came in every month like clockwork. Then more. Ghost vendor accounts, payments approved at unusual hours, service charges billed to tenants that didn't match any work orders I could find. I collected every record I could access without raising alarms. I wasn't ready to go to the board yet. I was still building the picture. Before I could finish building it, my cousin stood up at a meeting with my father and 2 senior managers and said I had been feeding tenant complaints directly to a competing property group in Burnaby. He said I had been sharing internal pricing data and lease renewal timelines with someone I knew at a rival company. He had nothing concrete, no emails, no paper trail, just his word and a tone of voice that made it sound like he had been carrying this disappointment for months. My father looked at me the way he sometimes looked at problems he didn't want to spend time on, and said we'd talk at home. We never did. At dinner 2 weeks later, he made his announcement at the Thanksgiving table, and that was the conversation. My mother watched me stand up and get my coat. She said nothing. I drove to my apartment in Mount Pleasant, made tea I didn't drink, and sat on my couch trying to understand what had just happened to my life. My phone buzzed sometime after midnight. An email from a law firm based in Victoria, Farker and Associates, marked urgent. They were reaching out regarding a matter of estate succession connected to my late grandmother, Cordelia Gallagher. They needed to confirm my identity and requested I come to their offices as soon as I was available. My grandmother had died 18 months earlier. We had been close when I was young, less close in the years before she passed, though I had always assumed that was just age and distance doing what they do. I had not expected to hear her name connected to anything urgent. The family had told me she left the North Vancouver house and some savings to my aunt. That was the end of it, as far as I understood. I booked a ferry to Victoria for the following Thursday. The law office was a quiet building near the waterfront. 2 lawyers, both careful with their words, sat across from me with a stack of sealed folders. After confirming my identity, they told me I should probably set aside a full morning. What they explained over the next 3 hours rearranged everything I thought I knew. My grandmother, Cordelia Gallagher, had not spent the last 2 decades of her life making small investments and attending community meetings. She had, quietly and methodically, built a separate real estate holding company, incorporated federally, managed through a numbered trust in British Columbia, that held 7 income-producing properties across the Lower Mainland, and 2 on Vancouver Island. The combined assessed value was $6.2 million CAD. It operated completely independently from Gallagher Property Group. My father did not know it existed. My cousin did not know it existed. As far as I could tell, nobody in the family did. One of the lawyers slid a bound summary across the table and let me turn the pages myself. She had watched what was happening inside the family company for years. According to notes she had left with the firm, she had been troubled by decisions my father made in the last decade. The way he promoted people based on personal trust rather than documented performance. The way financial controls had been loosened over time. The way serious concerns were absorbed into the culture and forgotten. She had not confronted him directly because she believed it would accomplish nothing. He would have dismissed her as out of touch. Instead, she had planned carefully. Years before she died, my grandmother drafted a corporate succession agreement naming me as the designated trustee of her holding company, and, under specific triggering conditions, giving me full legal authority over Gallagher Property Group's operating accounts as well. The conditions were precise. If a qualified forensic reviewer confirmed credible evidence of financial misconduct within the family company, I had the legal right to suspend all major operating accounts, including payroll reserves, maintenance funds, and capital acquisition accounts, pending an independent audit. No board vote required, no approval from my father. She chose me because, as she had written in a letter included in the documents, she had watched me work for years and seen someone who cared more about getting things right than about being liked for it. I read that sentence twice. I had left the Thanksgiving table 4 days ago carrying nothing except my coat and a humiliation I hadn't expected to survive intact. Now I was sitting in a law office in Victoria, looking at documents my grandmother had signed years earlier, documents that said she had been watching me the entire time, and had decided, long before any of this happened, that I was worth trusting. For the first time since my father pointed at the door, I felt something other than hollow. I could have acted within the week. The legal mechanism was already in place and everything was prepared. But the lawyers were clear, the suspension authority would be most defensible, and most effective, if it was triggered alongside documented evidence, not just my own suspicions. Acting on incomplete records would give my father's lawyers room to challenge the process. I needed to wait until the forensic reviewers had enough to make the case incontestable. So I waited, and I worked. The holding company's investigators were thorough. They requested document access through channels that didn't touch the main Gallagher Property Group servers directly, which meant nobody inside the company knew what was being reviewed. Piece by piece, a pattern took shape that was cleaner and more deliberate than I had realized. My cousin had built a small network of what looked, on paper, like legitimate service contractors. Plumbers, painters, HVAC technicians operating across the Lower Mainland. In practice, most of them existed only as numbered companies registered in Alberta with no operational presence in BC. Invoices came in monthly, payments went out. The work orders they claimed to support either didn't exist or were fabricated after the fact. Funds left Gallagher Property Group and arrived, through several transfers, in accounts my cousin controlled directly. Over approximately 3 years, the total came to just under $830,000. There was also a commercial lease in Coquitlam, a long-term contract with a tenant my cousin had brought in, where the terms had been altered after signing in a way that cost the company roughly $140,000 in foregone revenue. The original signed document and the version stored in the company's system did not match. Someone had gone back in and changed the numbers. The investigators traced every approval. My cousin had signed off on most of the fraudulent payments himself. The ones that required a second signature had my father's name on them. There was no evidence my father knew what he was approving. He trusted my cousin completely and signed what was put in front of him, which was its own kind of failure, but a different one. What I hadn't expected was what the forensic team found when they started pulling archived project files. Going back through 5 years of company records, they found something that had nothing to do with money. My name had been removed from several major initiatives I had led. A renegotiation of maintenance contracts across 12 residential buildings. Work I had done over 8 months, producing a 23% reduction in annual costs, was documented in the official company summary as having been led by my cousin. A compliance overhaul I had completed to bring the company into alignment with updated BC Residential Tenancy Act guidelines was attributed to a team he supposedly supervised. A tenant satisfaction program I had designed and implemented, which reduced vacancy complaints by more than a third over 2 years, bore his name in every document that went to the board. I sat with those files for a long time before I could continue reading. At first, I thought the records had been mislabeled by someone in administration. Then I noticed that the corrections always moved in the same direction. When something succeeded, my cousin's name appeared. When something was routine or problematic, mine stayed. The investigators confirmed that the changes had been made using administrative credentials that belonged to my father. He hadn't simply failed to give me credit. He had actively taken it away and handed it to someone else. Years of confusion became clear all at once. I had worked through weekends. I had handled the files nobody else wanted. I had brought results. I never fully understood why they didn't seem to matter when promotion discussions came around. I had questioned myself, wondered if I was reading the situation wrong, convinced myself I just needed to be more patient. The truth was that my father had been systematically erasing my contributions and building my cousin's reputation on top of them. The night I understood that, I didn't feel angry. I felt something quieter and more permanent. The Thanksgiving dinner wasn't the beginning of my father turning against me. It was just the first time he said it out loud. The forensic team completed their preliminary report on a Friday in late November. The following Monday morning, I signed the authorization. The emergency suspension clause became active at 9:17 a.m. Automated notifications went to RBC, TD, and 2 credit unions where Gallagher Property Group held accounts. Within minutes, the company's ability to move money in or out had stopped. Payroll reserves were frozen. Maintenance disbursement accounts were locked. Credit lines went inactive. A capital acquisition fund my father had been using to evaluate a new property in Surrey became inaccessible. I was sitting in a borrowed office in Victoria when the first call came into the law firm's main line. By noon, there had been 14. What followed inside the company over the next several days was, by all accounts, complete chaos. Property managers couldn't release funds to pay contractors. Tenant repair requests sat without approvals because nobody could access the accounts to process payments. A small commercial tenant called about an outstanding invoice that had been sitting unpaid for 6 weeks. Suppliers stopped responding to new requests. My father drove to the RBC branch in person and was told, politely and firmly, that the accounts were subject to a legal hold and that he would need to speak with the company's legal counsel. My cousin told anyone who would listen that the company had been targeted by a sophisticated external attack. He said it with the authority of someone who had been trusted for years, and some people found it plausible at first. But banks in Canada do not freeze accounts because of rumors or cyber attacks. They act when there is legal authority requiring them to act, and that authority had come from a valid corporate succession agreement executed by the company's founding family member. There was nothing my father could do to reverse it without going through a legal process that would require him to explain, in detail, exactly what had been happening inside his company's finances. By Wednesday, the BC Securities Commission had been notified of the forensic review. CRA was also flagged, given the nature of the fraudulent invoices and the potential for unreported income flowing through the numbered Alberta companies. Federal involvement changed the atmosphere entirely. What had started as a family business dispute was now being examined by regulators who had no interest in anyone's personal relationships. My family spent that week blaming everyone except the right people: a disgruntled former employee, a competitor in Burnaby, a government auditor who had it out for independent property managers. My cousin was vocal in every room, steering attention outward. I spent that week in a conference room in Victoria working through financial records with the forensic team and preparing the documentation that would go before the board. The shareholder meeting was called for the second Thursday in December. Board members arrived looking the way people look when they've already decided something is wrong, but haven't been told exactly what yet. My father was standing near the door when I walked in. He looked at me the way he used to look at things that didn't belong somewhere. "This meeting isn't for you," he said. The lead lawyer from Farker and Associates set a sealed package on the table in front of every board member before anyone could respond to that. What followed over the next 2 hours was methodical and, in places, very quiet. The lawyers walked the board through my grandmother's founding documents, her trust agreement, and the succession clause that had been activated. They presented the corporate registration records for her holding company and confirmed that the controlling interest had legally transferred to me at the point of suspension. They showed the forensic summary, the vendor analysis, the account records, and the archive project files where attribution had been changed. My cousin's face did not move through most of it. He sat very still, The way people sit when they are calculating whether there is still a way out. There wasn't. My father tried 3 times to redirect the room. Each time, the lead lawyer waited until he finished speaking and then continued from exactly where he had been interrupted. The room stayed composed throughout, which somehow made the weight of everything heavier. One board member asked my father directly whether he had reviewed the service contracts associated with the flagged vendors. He said he trusted the people who brought them to him. She made a note and moved on. The board voted at the end of the presentation. My father was removed as CEO by a margin that left no ambiguity. My cousin was permanently barred from any role with the company, operational or advisory. His devices were collected in the lobby and his keycard access was revoked before he reached the parking garage. The man who had been signing off on invoices and accepting credit for other people's work for years walked out of that building carrying nothing but the paperwork his lawyer had advised him to keep close. Several weeks passed before I heard from my mother. She asked to meet at a cafe she'd always preferred in Kitsilano. She arrived early and was already sitting when I got there. She looked tired in a way that wasn't about sleep. She told me she had known, for a long time, that things weren't right inside the company. She had heard conversations, noticed moments that didn't add up. She had also watched, over the years, as work I did seemed to find its way under other people's names. She had told herself it was an internal matter, that raising it would cause more damage to the family than letting it sit. She didn't try to make excuses sound like reasons. She just said she had been wrong to stay quiet, and that she was sorry. I sat with that for a moment before answering. I told her I believed her. I told her that believing her and moving forward were not the same thing right now, and that I needed time. We finished our coffee and hugged outside on the sidewalk. It wasn't a goodbye, it was just the first honest moment we'd had in a very long time. The restructuring of Gallagher Property Group took several months. Every department was reviewed by an outside firm. Financial approvals now required 2 independent sign-offs above a set threshold. An anonymous reporting system was established for employees who needed to raise concerns without risking their jobs. Several people who had been passed over for years because they hadn't known the right people were moved into roles they had earned long before that moment. The properties my grandmother's holding company owned were folded into a separate trust I administered. The income from them covered the legal costs of the restructuring, and then some. What was left, my grandmother had specified in her final notes, should support initiatives helping first-time renters in the Lower Mainland understand their rights under BC's Residential Tenancy Act. That felt like something she would have thought mattered. My father came to my office about 4 months after the board meeting. He sat down across from me, looking like a man who had spent the intervening months making peace with something difficult and hadn't quite finished. He told me the personal loan guarantees he had signed years earlier, secured against the expectation that his salary and executive compensation would continue indefinitely, were now a serious problem. 2 of the banks were calling the guarantees. He was looking at significant personal liability. He reminded me that we were family. He said he hoped we could find a way to handle things together. I listened to everything without interrupting. When he finished, I asked him if he remembered what he had said at the Thanksgiving table in October. He looked down at the desk. I repeated it for him, the same words, in the same tone I remembered him using. "Portia, I think you should leave now, and I don't think you should come back." The room was completely quiet after that. I told him that what he had said that evening wasn't a moment of frustration or a poor choice made in a heated argument. It was a decision he made deliberately, in front of every person in that house, and that decision had been the end of something real between us. Everything that came after, every document I signed, every account I froze, was a response to choices he and my cousin had been making for years, not something I had done to him. I wished him well. I meant that sincerely. I hoped he would find his way through the financial situation, and I hoped whatever came next would give him time to sit with what had built it. He stood up, nodded once, and walked out. I did not feel like I had won anything. I felt like I had finally stopped losing. The following October, Canadian Thanksgiving came around again, and for the first time in my adult life, I celebrated it exactly the way I wanted to. My apartment in Mount Pleasant couldn't fit everyone, so I borrowed a friend's place in East Vancouver, a narrow, warm house on East 4th, with a table that seated 12 if you pushed it close to the wall. I made the butter chicken my university roommate had taught me years ago, alongside roasted root vegetables and a wild rice dish I'd been perfecting for months. Someone brought Nanaimo bars. Someone else brought a bottle of Okanagan wine that turned out to be better than it had any right to be. The people around that table were ones I had chosen and ones who had chosen me back. A colleague who had been the first person inside the company to tell me privately that she believed something was wrong. A neighbor who had left a bag of groceries at my door the week after Thanksgiving the year before, without being asked and without making a thing of it. 2 university friends who lived across the country now but had come back to Vancouver for the long weekend. A woman I had met through the tenant rights work my grandmother had specified, who had been advocating for renters in East Van for 15 years, and who made me laugh more than almost anyone I had ever met. Before everyone arrived, I wrote 2 letters, one to my father and one to my mother. I thanked them both for what they had taught me, even when the lessons had not been the ones they intended. I told them I was doing well. I told them I held no bitterness, which was true. I sealed both envelopes and left them with a courier to be delivered the following morning. At dinner, someone suggested we go around the table and share one thing we were grateful for. When it came to my turn, I looked around at all of it. The mismatched dishes, the fogged windows from all the cooking, the sound of the rain coming down outside on the wet street, and I said I was grateful for the things that had been built to last. Nobody needed me to explain what I meant. That felt like exactly the right kind of room to be in. My grandmother had spent years building something she knew she might never see used. She had watched the people around her make choices she couldn't change, and instead of giving up or finding a way to stop caring, she had planned carefully for a future she might not live to see. She had looked at me from a distance and decided I was worth trusting before I had any idea I was even being considered. I think about her often. I think about what it takes to hold your faith in someone quietly, without ever telling them, and to build something for them anyway. If you have ever been made to feel invisible by the very people who should have seen you clearly, or if someone in your life built something for you in silence, I would love to hear about it. Leave your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and if this story reached you when you needed it, please pass it along. Someone you know might need it tonight too.